Hello and welcome to Your Coaching Journey, a podcast for doctors about coaching. Whether you're a coaching doctor, a doctor who is learning to coach, or a doctor who'd like to build coaching into your professional life, then this is the podcast for you. Hello, I'm Tom Dillon, and with me today is my co-host and business partner, Helen Leathers. Good morning, Helen. How are you?
I'm very well, thank you. How are you?
I've become conscious of the fact that I really have to stop and think about how I say your name, because I tend to trip over your saying of your name. So, Helen Leathers, I have to enunciate.
Yes, it's always.
But I got through it. I did it.
Yes.
Yeah. Morning.
Morning.
How are you?
I'm very well, thank you.
Good.
How are you?
I'm very well, thank you. What are we talking about today, Helen?
Today we are going to be talking about neuroscience in coaching.
How lovely.
I know. I like a bit of neuroscience. Yeah. It's a bit daunting when you're training doctors and there's a neuroscientist on your course, which we do have.
We do have one at the moment, yeah.
But it's a great topic. We're not neuroscientists. I'd just like to put that out there first of all.
But that's good.
So this is a really interesting subject, and it's one of the topics that we do explore on our transformational coaching diploma. So, Tom, what is the neuroscience approach to coaching?
Well, I just want to say before we get going that there's very little neuroscience that's actually being conducted around the actual activity of coaching. And really, there's only a couple of two very small studies by Richard Boyatzis and Anthony Jack that involve any sort of fMRI scanning or anything like that. And they weren't doing the scanning whilst people were being coached.
That would be a bit weird, wouldn't it? Coaching someone in a
It would be a little bit weird, but I'm not sure how you then manage to say, well, that study is related to coaching. I mean, it's related to coaching, but it's not actually a neuroscience study on coaching.
In the moment of being coached.
Yeah.
Okay.
So I just want to frame that when people talk about neuroscience in coaching, we're not talking about neuroscience going on in the coaching room. We're talking about areas of neuroscience that might be interesting to explore within coaching.
Tell me a little bit about those studies.
So there were just two small studies. I think in total about 66 people were involved in the studies, so very, very small. And the first study they did involved people having some coaching, two different methods of coaching. One was coaching for what they call compliance of, well, how are you doing? How are you going to overcome the problems you're going to get? And the other one was around visioning. And then a week later, they put them into an fMRI scanner and prompted them, made statements around each of those things that reminded them of their coaching, and then looked at the brain imaging that came from that. And then they did have some findings, but I say it's quite tricky to say, well, that's because of coaching. So we'll talk about that a little bit more later.
Okay.
But so very little actual neuroscience in the coaching room.
So that's a great setting of the scene. Let's just frame neuroscience itself for our listeners. What are we talking about when we talk about neuroscience?
So we're talking about the scientific study of the nervous system, so including the brain, and it's about understanding neurons and neural circuits. It encompasses a number of different disciplines, including cytology.
That's the study of cells.
Yes. Neurology.
The study of nerves.
Yes. And hodology.
Okay, what's that? I have no idea.
The study of connections.
Okay.
And if you're thinking about neuroscience, it's all about those neural connections that are made. So that's another part of it. Anatomy, physiology, molecular biology, psychology, developmental biology. And if we explore social neuroscience, then we're also bringing in things like social and behavioural sciences. So there's an awful lot of ground to cover with neuroscience.
So this sounds fascinating. I think a lot of it's not going to be related to coaching. There's a lot of research to choose from, though. So what is relevant to coaching?
Well, I think if we have an awareness of neuroscience theory, that can help us to understand our coachees' motivations and decision-making processes. It can also help us to understand some aspects of our clients' social reactions, including their stress responses. It can help us to understand how their brains deal with change. It can help us to understand their emotional responses to situations. It might help us to understand some neurodiversity of different clients coming to us. And it might help us to understand the neuroplasticity of our brains and how we can create new neural connections. So all of those things I think are really useful in the coaching room. And so on the back of that, we can support our coachees to be able to use strategies to help them feel motivated. So if we think about the reward system in the brain, then we can start to apply strategies or help our coachees apply strategies that help them make good choices. We can help them to navigate their social world with an awareness of what might provoke a stress or a reward response in social situations. We can help them to engage with change in ways that are helpful for them. And we can help them to understand and manage their emotional reactions.
So there's plenty to think about here. And actually, if we're thinking about thinking, we're thinking about behaviour, we're thinking about habits, it all goes on in the brain. So having this awareness is going to really help us as coaches. So where would be a good place to start in thinking about neuroscience in coaching?
So I think a great place to start with neuroscience is recognising that as humans, our brain and our nervous system are both incredibly complex, and they allow us to do extraordinary things that no other creatures on Earth can do. And at the same time, we're terribly flawed and full of inconsistencies and idiosyncrasies that mean both our hardware and our software are a bit faulty. So I think if we were an AI version, if we bought an AI version of us, we'd probably send it back because it doesn't really, it's not logical all of the time, is it?
No, not at all. I like that. Say more about this.
Yeah, so we're heavily influenced by our perception through our senses. And obviously the one that takes in the most information per second is our sight. So we're reliant on our sight, but unless you're visually impaired, but for most of us, we're reliant on our sight as the main sensory organ. So we will process lots of information, but our sight doesn't always tell us what's really going on. It's our perception of what's going on. And then next is our hearing, and then all of the other different senses, sense of touch, things like that. And smell, taste, all of those senses. So they all feed into our nervous system. And so that's complex enough in and of itself. And then we have to navigate other aspects of our senses. So we have a sense of interoception.
So that's knowing how something feels within our body.
Yeah, so we're aware of that. Not all of the time, but we do become aware of that. We have proprioception.
And that's knowing how our body is moving and where it is in space around us.
Yeah, so there's another complexity that we're adding into what information we're taking in. So there's lots going on within our nervous system that we have to contemplate. And then on top of that, we have our feelings.
Oh, then it gets complex, doesn't it?
And our feelings are obviously heavily influenced by our interoception, so that what's going on in our body and recognising that, but also feeling tired, feeling stressed, feeling pain, whether it's physical or emotional pain, feeling uncomfortable, feeling energised, feeling confident, feeling anticipation. So all of those feelings feed into our nervous system as well, our neural architecture. So there's an awful lot wrapped up in those. And there's obviously from our feelings, then we have stronger emotions that come up, and emotions sit within our nervous system as well. So we'll have those intense episodes that lead us to maybe some sense of arousal that tell us that something's important and that we might want to take some action around it. So that's going on for us as well. And then added on top of that, we have our memories. And our memories are particularly tricky for us because we all have them, but we don't necessarily know whether they are accurate or not. And particularly with emotional memories, we will have really strong emotional memories, but they can be really flawed because at the time that those strong emotional memories are created, we might be suffering from a stress response, which means we don't see the world perhaps as it is. We're not quite as logical in those moments, but we remember them really well.
And this is reminding me a lot of the cognitive behavioural approach to coaching that we talked about in episode 14. And we've got all these filters and all of these, our values and our memories and all of these are interlinked with all of the other things that you've just mentioned.
Yeah.
So it's
but then,
complicated, aren't they?
And then on top of that, we have our drives. So those strong drivers that sit underneath emotions, so that are actually connected to our needs. So hunger, comfort, connection, reproduction, all of those needs that sit there that create drivers that aren't actually emotional, but they're there anyway. So that's another complexity. And then we have our hormones. and how our hormones impact on us and the events in our lives, they will have an impact.
Yeah, and certainly for a lot of women, that's a really important issue to have an understanding of in terms of monthly changes and changes that happen around my age.
Yes.
So it's very complex. And it also strikes me that we've got this complexity added to it, that we've got a very primal body that works in an animalistic way. And on top of that, we have our evolved thinking, which again is flawed, but that adds multiple levels of complexity.
Yeah, so like you say, our basic biology is still, caveman biology, isn't it? That's not really changed, but the world around us has changed dramatically. So we're trying to cope with a prehistoric body that hasn't really changed, but what we have to deal with. And just if we think about the change that's happened in the last 10 years, we're coping with exponential change and a rate of change that we're just not used to as humans. So that all adds to it as well. So we've talked about hormones, but then on top of that, we have this idea of neuroplasticity, which is that idea that our neural connections are changing all the time, and that the brain is changing. So during adolescence, that's probably the time when it's changing the most, but throughout our lives, we're quite capable of changing the neural connections and learning something new. So we have a lot of coachees that might come to us and say, well, I'm too old now, I can't possibly learn to play the piano now. But what we know is that those neural connections can be strengthened, and we can find new pathways to doing new things and create new muscle memory. So
when you say muscle memory, which is a phrase a lot of people use, what we actually mean is neural memory, a nerve pathway that's been laid down. Yeah, so we're creating those new neural connections in our brain that allow us to do things without us thinking too much about it. So like for me playing tennis, I have new neural connections that have only been created in the last 3 years that allow me to do incredible things without me having to stop and think about them. And obviously my muscles do change to some extent, but the neural connections are what really makes the difference in that. So when I whip a ball across the court for a winner, that's, all that neural connection has been created, that I know how to do that. Yeah. But that's new. That's an old man creating new neural connections. So all of that is really fascinating. And if we weren't aware of that ability that we have to create those new neural connections, we might agree with someone, nah, you're too old. Yeah, forget that. Yeah, people become set in their ways and think that they can't change. And of course, this neuroscience shows that we can. And that carries on into our 90s. It doesn't have to stop. But obviously some people will just think, well, no, that's it. Can't teach an old dog new tricks. And they think it's done. So I think that's really important to have an awareness of as a coach as well. So there's an awful lot going on in neuroscience that isn't the neuroscience of coaching, but these are things, this is an awareness that we can bring to coaching and that can really enrich our coaching if we stop to think about it and study it a little bit. Lovely. So how can we use neuroscience in the coaching room? Well, as I've mentioned before, we've got that study from Richard Boyatzis and Anthony Jacks, a very small study, but I think it does back up probably what we tend to think of as good coaching practice. So that idea that for us, we stop to think about a future vision and we get people to think about their desired future, how they want to be in the future, rather than, okay, what's the problem you're having now? How are you going to overcome it? How are you going to get there faster? So Richard Boyatzis describes that as coaching for compliance, and the opposite of that is what they would call coaching for compassion, which is an odd phrase. I'm not sure why they chose coaching. That's not compassion. Compassion is recognising the suffering in others and being driven to do something to help ease their suffering. That's compassion. He's taken a word and made it mean something different. So anyway, coaching for compassion is all about that future vision of looking to the future. How do you want to be in the future? Where do you want to be? What do you want to be doing? So we know that that's a really good place to be in coaching and to spend time in that space. So the neuroscience research that he's done
backs that up. I'm not convinced by the research itself and the methodology behind the research, but it does back up what we would say is good coaching practice. So we want to keep people in a good place. We want to use the positive emotional attractors in the brain to keep people in a good place and to be doing some creative thinking, some generative thinking. And that's really good if we're doing that visioning stuff.
And that links in with our previous episode that we talked about, where we talked about goals.
Yes.
And our idea that coaching is more than goals. And
Yes.
it sounds like this absolutely confirms that.
Yes, so if we're coaching for compliance and go, well, how are you going to do that? When are you going to do it by? We might take someone to a place where the negative emotion attractors are being activated and they start to go, maybe not quite to a threat response, but they will start to feel uneasy. And that's not what we want people to do in the coaching room.
So they start to get a stress reaction.
Yeah, a stress reaction. So, and that's obviously not what we want in the coaching room.
No.
We want to be encouraging and get them to do some new thinking. And obviously, when it comes to taking action, there might be a little bit of discomfort of, okay, I've actually got to do something about this thing I've been talking about. But we want to keep them in a good place. So I think the research that Boyatzis and Jack have done does back up the fact that if, as we work as a coach, we can keep people safe and keep people in that space of generating new thinking, we're going to do good work. If we push them in terms of speed and efficiency and everything else, and we've got to get this done, then that's probably not going to be effective coaching. So I think that's really useful work to think about. And there are a couple of papers that they've published about their work, so I think they're worth exploring. I feel a little bit uneasy criticising someone that I'm not criticising. He's done good work, but I feel a little bit uneasy doing some critical evaluation around his studies, because it is the only work that's been done around coaching in terms of neuroscience. So I think, well, there's someone who's interested in coaching. They're doing some research around it. Okay, it's not perfect, but there is some research being done.
But on the other hand, we can't just accept these studies. We have to challenge, and they would expect to be critically evaluated.
Yeah, and obviously they've been peer reviewed. It's been published. Yeah. It's published research. So someone has been looking at it, but I've not seen that sort of challenge to it of, okay, well, this is a really small study, and actually you are putting people through an fMRI scanner a week after they've had some coaching and just creating some prompts that sort of remind them of the coaching. So how is that research around coaching? So I say I have some issues with the methodology, but Richard Boyatzis does a lot of public speaking around this stuff. So he seems a nice guy. And it's all we've got to go on. Yeah. So, yeah, I think we have to sort of take it.
But I think that is important, that just because it backs up our thinking, we don't just accept it. We do challenge it.
It is reassuring that if their findings had been completely the opposite way round, then we might have had to rethink our view on the world. But yeah, it's good to challenge. So that's something to be aware of. I think something else to be aware of, again, it's not specifically neuroscience. The work of David Rock, which has been around for a good 10 years now. David Rock came up with a concept called SCARF, which is a model that looks at the social interactions that we have. And he uses the work of neuroscientists like Naomi Eisenberger, Matthew Lieberman, Evan Gordon, who all do social neuroscience. So they look at our reactions to what's going on in the world. And he came up with this idea of SCARF, which is looking at the domains that really impact us in a social environment.
Okay.
So he looks at status, certainty, autonomy, relatedness and fairness. And he takes each of those and looks at what he calls the organising principle of the brain. Now, he's taken that phrase from Evan Gordon. I'm not sure he's applied it in quite the way it was intended, but the organising principle of the brain, David Rock would suggest, is that we maximise the reward and we minimise the threat. And that's what we're constantly trying to do. Going back to what we were saying about us being animalistic in our makeup, that's going on inside us, that we're trying to look for the reward. So, in terms of food, searching out food, and we're trying to minimise any threat to us.
Yeah.
So if we take those 5 domains, in any of those domains, if we're in a social environment, just one of them being impacted could lead to us having a threat response. So if you're coaching someone and it has anything to do with other people and they're struggling, it might well be that one of those domains is being impacted.
And that, when you say triggering the threat response, that would trigger the fight or flight response within us.
The sympathetic nervous system would be activated. Yes. I'm a little bit wary of the fight or flight. I think in some ways it's oversimplistic.
Yes, I understand that, yeah.
So I think the sympathetic nervous system will be activated and we will have a stress response. So it might lead us to want to run away or fight someone, but we might want to do other things as well. We're more complex than that, I think. So, I think we're going to do a whole episode on the scarf model.
Yes, because it's actually really useful, isn't it, in terms of the social interaction.
And I think it is interesting that it's someone that isn't a neuroscientist. He's created a term called neuro-leadership. So I think he's tried to get that as part of organisational terminology. I'm not sure it's quite caught on. But he's someone that's managed to take some neuroscience and actually introduce it to the world in a way that I think is really helpful.
Great, I can't wait to have that conversation about that episode.
Yeah, so that might be actually a good place to leave this episode and pick up again in terms of looking at SCARF in more detail.
Just one thing, because you mentioned that sympathetic nervous system.
Yes.
And of course, that is a neurological response.
Yes.
That's part of neuroscience.
It is, yeah.
So for us as coaches, having an understanding of the sympathetic and the parasympathetic nervous system and how they impact us could also be an important part of helping others.
Absolutely. I'm not sure why we haven't talked about that before. We should have started with that.
Probably, yes. Because it's what's going on in our brain when we perceive a threat, and it's designed to keep us safe. And again, the triggers within us, the neurology that's happening, all of the release of sugars from our muscles to help us fight or run, all of those things in a modern world sometimes are not helpful.
No, actually, I had an incident of this a couple of days ago. I was doing some mediation. So I sat with 2 people who obviously have some issues with each other. And it was really interesting to see the different threat responses come out. So there was a lady who, her threat response was obviously some anxiety, but also she was angry. So it was a complex reaction, but she was sat next to me. So there was a tremor. There was a visible sort of physical reaction going on, and she was writing things down just to keep herself safe and not to react in a different way. So that was her strategy for keeping herself safe, which worked, and she came through that, and you could see her then start to relax as the mediation went on. On the opposite side of the table was someone who was very sure of himself, or presented himself as being very confident, very assertive, quite bullish really. But you could see underneath that there was a stress response that was going on that was a threat. So by him being involved in mediation, there was some threat response going on for him. So that was visible. I could see that. And it came out as wanting to fight, but it came from a place of threat. So it's really interesting stuff.
Yeah.
And that's mediation, so it's slightly different to coaching. But you can see when someone comes into the coaching room and they start to talk about incidents that have happened, that stress response will be evident when they talk about it.
It can happen in the coaching.
So I think it is really important to have an understanding of it. I think because we deal with this stuff so much, we tend to think people know all about the fight or flight response and the stress response is sympathetic nervous system, but of course people don't necessarily have an awareness of it. So I think it's good to talk about it.
And even if we don't expect necessarily a response in the coaching room, but sometimes a client having an awareness of their own responses when they're in a social situation will really help them to manage it, and having an understanding of how they can counter it with the use of breath and by activating the parasympathetic nervous system, we can do a little bit of an educative piece around that
Yeah.
that helps them to stay calm.
Yeah, I think that's a new podcast.
That's a whole new
It's
podcast.
a whole new podcast.
Isn't it?
But it brings us back to the SCARF model, which is all about that stress response, or maybe the reward response, but the
Yeah.
reward and threat response and how people might deal with it. But having an awareness of what might be impacted for them.
Which
So
we're going to talk about next
We're going to
time.
talk about next time. So
Excellent.
wonderful, thank you. We've a bit of a quick dip into neuroscience. Obviously, it's a huge topic, and say its relationship to coaching is complex, and it's good to have an awareness of it. How we use it in the coaching room is going to be limited, but I think just having some understanding so that we can share that with our coachees is useful.
Absolutely.
So thank you for that, Helen. Really
Thank
enjoyed
you.
that.
Yeah. And we'll see you next time for that SCARF model.
Next time will be SCARF, yes.
And don't forget to subscribe so that you don't miss out on any of our episodes. And we'll see you next time. Bye for now.
Bye-bye.
This has been a Monkey Pants Productions podcast.